Okay, so this is video number 6, but we're going to have to deviate from our regular pattern for this piece and maybe the next piece or two, because we have very long pieces ahead of us. Perek Vav, Perek Zayin, Perek Ches are all pretty long, and then we kind of go back to the shorter pieces. And just to even get into Perek Vav, it's called Ha'aras Maaseh Bereshis Maaseh Merkava. So that means like the light of or revelation of the Maaseh Bereshis, which we could translate for now, usually means like the act of creation. It really is reference to statements in the Gemara made about how stuff kind of works, the system of how this whole thing that we experience, how it's set up, what is the structure of it. And there's what's called Maaseh Merkava, which is essentially another. Let's kind of keep it simple for now, but Maaseh Merkava could be described as a description of the underlying intangible mechanics and what their purpose is. So you could think of it as like, well, Maaseh Bereshis is kind of like an integrated perspective of physical reality, physics, and all of the rules and laws of what you see around you, and sort of how that is manifest as an expression of intangible reality. And then Maaseh Merkava is like the mechanics of the intangible reality very directly. So you can kind of look at it as if you kind of look at the intangible side as being above in our analogy, and the physical, what we experience around us, in the tangible side as being below. So then Maaseh Bereshis is kind of looking at this and sort of seeing somewhat how it kind of comes from this. And Maaseh Merkava is kind of looking at this and kind of sort of seeing how it goes down to this. That's like a pretty useful graphic analogy or perspective, how to think about these two things. Now, the tricky thing with this piece is that you kind of have to know a little bit more about some of Rav Kook's perspectives, and it's not even Rav Kook really, because it kind of takes away to say it like that, as if it's like Rav Kook's idea or something. But Rav Kook here really captures a very, very clear, intense, I don't even say moving, because not emotionally moving, but a very profound and intensely powerful way of thinking about the track that we're on and where things are going. And so I'm going to try to give a little bit of an introduction conceptually of how to sort of access or tap into that. And then as we actually read it, so we're going to try to sort of see that. So this is going to be like an intro video to Perek Vav. So we're going to just title this one Perek Vav Introduction, and then there's going to be another video, Perek Vav, actual Perek Vav. So in order to sort of unpack this and give this intro, I have to sort of talk about something which is kind of going on right in front of us. It's so obvious and so in front of us that it's hard to see it. When you kind of tap into this way of thinking about it, so it really sort of changes how we see this thing that's right in front of us. So in order to talk about that clearly, so first you have to kind of relate to a concept that we spoke about earlier, which is, we mentioned in the last video and in a few other videos that we have biological bodies. Now, everything I'm going to say now, there's a lot of things in the Gemara and a lot of things in the Chumash and a lot of things in the Rishonim that kind of are the backbone of this. I'm trying to sort of simplify it for now, just sort of give the idea very clearly. But this is all rooted in the story of what's called the story of the Eitz Hadas. It's in Parshas Bereshis. And basically, the way the Gemara describes is that we now have bodies that are biological, which means they're much more tangible than they used to be. But we are not our bodies. We are intangible selves, what we call in English consciousness, we call it a neshama. These are terms that we started to sort of try to use and throw around in these videos, trying to be as nuanced as possible. But we are something which is not tangible, not measurable. This whole self-awareness experience, this whole this conception of self, and this idea that I'm an essence of some kind, that like there's a me that is now trying to connect to the other self that's over there, and that's another me or another they, or whatever terms we want to use for these things. So we all intuitively experience these things in either more primitive or more advanced ways. And depending on how you live your life, you can actually enhance your awareness of yourself as being not your body. But basically, we have biological bodies. And the issue with biological bodies is that they have certain patterns that are repeating. And those patterns are what's called in the Chumash chet. Chet means the capacity to deviate from reality, or from what kind of is right in front of you, and you kind of go off the path. And biological bodies have the capacity to do that because our bodies, like we mentioned in the last video, have a tendency towards inertia. biological bodies are like, we are not our bodies, but we experience ourselves as being what's called in a lot of different places in like the Rav Chaim Vital's, I think it's in Shari Kedusha, talks about the mixing together of the body and the self, and how we sometimes hyper identify ourselves as our bodies. And whenever we do that, so then when our body is kind of going on a certain track, we think to ourselves, well, this is the track that I'm on, I should be on this track. When we kind of abdicate the capacity to change tracks because we associate ourselves so intensely as our body. This inertial tendency means that even though life is a constantly changing and shifting context, everything, the one constant in this space is change, which is a very important and central principle in the Torah, which needs to be discussed in its own right. But right now we're just going to focus on how, since the reality that we live in is a constantly evolving, dynamic, changing context, so to try to go onto autopilot in any form, or to even just accidentally even be on autopilot, means that when the directions suddenly change from this way to that way, even in reverse, and whichever way that things change, so for us to adjust in biological bodies is very difficult, because our biological bodies like to tend and trend in the direction that they're already going. And so, for example, we call that, like as an example, habituation, mitzvah sanashim milumada. We have a way of doing things in a certain way that we've done for a long time, and then suddenly the situation no longer requires us to do that thing in the same way, but we kind of keep doing it. So it's these are repeating behaviors, and there's so many examples. I mean, in interactions with family members, so we tend to develop habits of how we talk to each other and how we react to each other emotionally. And so our biology, which is our emotional format, our perceptions, what's called our keter, it's the crown of how we see things. So that basically becomes more and more, it can be influenced by experiences, and then you can actually start to perceive someone that you loved very deeply as someone who you actually are in competition with them. So that happens very often between spouses who create unhealthy habits of how they see and think about each other, and then that creates also emotional convictions that kind of build on top of that. And to suddenly, like, let's say if you have a certain habit where if your spouse asks you a question about your job or how you're doing in your work, and if you have had a habituation or training process in your marriage where over time you've become more defensive with each other, so that question could be experienced by you as a question you need to defend against. And that's something which, even if they're not being attacking in any way, so why are you being defensive? It's not the appropriate response. The answer is because you have a habituated way of thinking about something like that, and then you tend to read it in a certain way. So that's what chet is, because the reality is X, but you're used to reality being Y, and so you're kind of deviating from reality and going off the rails now to kind of miss the mark of how to really read what's happening in your situation. That's a very simple example. We can use much more classical examples of Yetzer Hara things that people tend to talk about in more, I would say, unsophisticated ways of thinking about what the Torah is saying. So we could talk about it as chet. We have a lot of Christian overtones and assimilated ideas that we were the source of what the concept of chet in the Torah, and then it kind of got taken over by a lot of other people who are not really, fully Torah people as we are. And then what happened was we took it back from them in a new form. So now people talk about sin, which has nothing to do with chet. At least sin tends to mean doing something wrong. So doing something wrong is a very different thing than being chotei, because when you do something wrong, that's very vague. You can't just do something wrong in a vacuum. Something wrong is only called wrong in a certain context. There's a set of rules that applies to something. So this would be wrong if those rules say that the result that we're trying to achieve is different from what this would achieve. Then it's wrong for this. But it can't just be wrong in general. So when people say that something you're doing is wrong or morally wrong, so it's very hard. That's a very undefined thing, which is why there's so many arguments about morals and religion in the world, which is also a separate discussion. But the point I'm making now is that the concept of chet by itself does not mean to be wrong or to do a sin. A sin is, again, something which needs to be defined more carefully what people are even saying when they say that. A chet means that you're missing the mark. So in a situation in which you are violating some other thing the Torah says, the Torah has a particular set of results that it is trying to create for you. And when you do actions that deviate from that result, in which you're to'eh, from the path of the result you're trying to create, that's called a chet. Like the word to'eva, which means to be to'eba. It means that you're using this thing to now deviate from the particular reality or the particular context that you're in. And you're thinking that this is the way to do things, but you're kind of following a habituated way of being that now takes you away from a particular thing that is really this way. So when you think about that a little bit and how that's really a function of these bodies, in other words, the oscillations of kind of getting off the rails in those ways are not things that have to be that way. It's just that our perceptions and our thoughts and our emotional makeup, all these things are very dynamic. They're wired in a certain way, and we are programmed in terms of, our bodies are programmed in terms of all these rules that have to do with mammalian features, biological features that now are interfacing with a self that is not mammalian, that is not body oriented. So if you think about that carefully, and I know this is going to sound a little bit scary perhaps to some people, because thinking about it in this way is like, wait, so does this mean that my body is bad? Or it's not that our bodies are bad. It's we have to understand what our bodies tend to do and to identify which things are us, me, and which things are my body. So as you learn to harness and then all the Torah teachings and the Kabbalah teachings and all the structures of what's called the Sfirot and the Olamot are designed to sort of show you which parts are you, and then how the things that you, all the different tools that you have, like your emotions, like your thoughts, these things are not you. You can learn how to control them, and how to sort of realize how they evolve and how they even operate. So all this is part of the journey of self-awareness that HaKodesh is kind of about, trying to understand the underlying internal mechanics of what this thing is and how we are kind of manifest in it. Think of our body as the bottom and the self is at the top, same way as Hashem is the endless, intangible HaKodesh is for all of reality at the top, and then the physical manifestation that is at the bottom. We are directly analogical to that. So just take that a little further for a second. So the track that we're really on here, if you think about it a little carefully, is that over time, we are achieving greater and greater and greater control of this tool to become more and more and more like Hashem. What does that mean, like Hashem? So when you think about, like, to be domeh la Hashem, to be domeh la Elokim, in a very basic way, we tend to think of it as ma'hu rachum af ata rachum, like you should try to be nice to people, caring. That's a very, again, like it's a very basic level, which is not really so clearly defined, and there's a lot more to expand on that. And think about Hashem. Well, Hashem is completely kadosh. What does that mean? To be kadosh means you are dedicated to something, which means you have your thing that you're here to do, and you unerringly stick to that. And we are trying to be like Hashem. We're trying to be kadoshim to you, trying to become more and more. We are more dynamic. Hashem is always kadosh. We are trying to become more dedicated to Hashem. And He is always attached to His purpose. We are trying to get more and more and more directed towards it. The question, of course, is what is that purpose? And we're going to try to explain that also. We probably won't be able to describe it in this video, but the point I'm trying to make right now is to be more like Hashem means that over time we become more put together, where we are aware of all the different parts of ourselves. We understand with total or relatively total comprehension how the different structures inside of ourselves operate, and we know how to kind of actively utilize the different parts of our characters and of our bodies and when to use them. And when do I use my body to eat? When do I not use it for that? When do I use my body to think certain thoughts? Can I control my thoughts? How do I use my emotions? What is the purpose of emotions? How do I direct them to make sure that they're in harmony? How do I learn to actually cry when it's in harmony with truth and reality to cry, and when to laugh when it's in harmony with reality and truth to laugh? How do I learn to see things as they are in that way and constantly, incrementally get a clearer and clearer understanding of reality around me so that I can actually then react and behave in accordance with what is actually happening around me? So take that a little further for a second. Well, what if instead of having biological bodies where the perceptions are sometimes unfortunately influenced, perception is supposed to be at the top, they sometimes get influenced by things at the bottom, and then you don't even realize sometimes you can actually get into a place where mentally you become depressed without even realizing, or you get weirdly happy, or we have all kinds of mental illnesses as different knots are formed in our neurological structures, and we get caught in loops, and we think whether it's an OCD situation or other kinds of mental illnesses where we get caught in mental structures that we can't even escape because we can't even see the exits inside of our minds. There's so many different examples of how these things kind of interplay with each other, all the different facets and tools and pieces of the character and the system that we're kind of using on the tangible side. So to become more like Hashem really means to slowly kind of heal and put all that together and kind of rise above that and learn to control those things. And then if you think about what that would be, what if we could find a way to actually, instead of having hormones that, let's say, trigger by stimuli where it's not the right time for that. A classic example is what we call in the Gemara's language and in the Achronim Rishonim's language, histaklus. When you have men and women who relate to each other in a sexual way, they're aware of each other sexually, even though there is no sexual context that is justifiable in that setting. So, we have a lot of issues in the workplace today because now we have men and women working together in the workplace, and men and women are attracted to each other in sexual ways because there is a biological imperative to reproduce that comes with a set of tools. So the question is, well, why should it be that way? If what's happening is the body is kind of looking at a situation saying, this is a mating situation, but the other part of you, the part that's transcendent, the part that is beyond, and even parts of you that are not beyond, that are even more logical, that are still part of the tangible side, the Bina side and whatever, are looking at the situation and saying, well, I know it's not a mating situation, and yet I can't really control my body's wanting to mate. So the Torah and all these teachings are designed to sort of clarify how the mating urge kind of is triggered, so you can actually learn to see things not that way, to control your perceptions, to not view that other person as a potential mating partner, and actually only activate that when it is the proper thing to be doing, to reproduce with a person, the person that you have decided to commit to, so that way that there's commitment and there's depth and there's connection, as opposed to just haphazard, spontaneous triggering of hormonal reactions inside of this tool. So what if we find a way around that? In other words, what if, instead of having to use the Torah to develop very deep understanding of ourselves and learn to dominate that, let's say in the next 50 to 100 years, we can find a way where we can actually take very precise control of many parts of the body. We'll give an example, using something like tiny robots, which today are called nanotechnology, and we could actually have a situation where we could have complete control over the inner situations and mechanics of the body itself, so that I can actually decide when to turn on reproduction-oriented hormones to trigger my body to then be interested in that activity. What about that? What about situations where we can actually slowly but surely transcend our bodies even more? Why do we have to even be mammals? It's not that we are mammals. It's that we have bodies that are mammalian bodies, which we didn't even used to have. But then the whole story of the Garden of Eden, the Gan Eden story, led to us having these kinds of bodies. So what if we could have a situation where we don't have bodies that do these things anymore? We could actually have a far more advanced type of kli, a merkava, that we can actually use to accomplish all the things that we're here to sort of be accomplishing in a more and more increasingly expanding basis. Well, if you had a body or a toolkit that was more balanced and more clear and more powerful, I mean, there's endless ability. I'll just point out already how we're sort of on the trend towards that. There's something in the world today called technology. And technology interacts with biological bodies in different ways depending on the situation. So there's a lot of debates and discussions about whether technology is good, technology is bad. Technology, the label, can cause a lot of confusion, because what technology is, all it is more and more precise control of the physical world around us by us discovering and uncovering the mechanics of reality. And we're going to see in this piece how that's exactly the trend that is supposed to happen as time passes, as we get more and more and more towards the phase of ultimate release from these bodies, so what we call the stage of Olam Haba, which we're going to discuss in a second what exactly that looks like. But the point I'm making here is that technology is not a thing. Technology is a label that we use to describe the process of greater and greater control over the reality, the physical reality. And basically, you think that as Hashem is giving us the keys to this place that He is in control of on that level of precision, we're becoming more and more and more like Hashem in that way. The tricky part is the more powerful we become, so the more I shouldn't say the more, but the biological tendencies, the trend, inertia-oriented aspects, the capacity to be chote, is triggered in new ways each time we have a new situation in the world. So we have now new situations that, just like in the past, people's eyes would cause them to be attracted to certain things in a way that was very addictive. What does it mean to be addicted? It means that you following this thing, even though now it's time to do that thing, you just keep going after this thing. So now we have a new version of that. We have a lot of screens, and those screens, each screen has a different thing on it, and some of those things are things that are good to use, and even in certain situations they are, I should say good is a little vague, but that are useful for particular purposes. Some things are less useful. Some things take us away from what it is that we're here to really be about. There's all kinds of different permutations of this. But it's not that the technology, quote, is a problem. It's that those things are just manifestations of our capacity to control reality. What's happening is it's interacting with our biological toolkit in a way that is a little bit difficult for us to figure out how to remain on track with these new things. And as time passes, we will continue to conquer each of these things. Every generation, there's going to be always more things like that. But we're kind of getting to the end of the line here, which is that we're getting to a point where we're really starting to be much more like Hashem, not just in our control of reality, but even in our capacity to transcend time and space. Think about this for a second. So I could right now I'm doing it right now with this video even, but I can FaceTime, quote, my family in Israel, in America, anywhere, anytime, and I'm basically there. And you'll say, well, it's not the same because this is, you could hug someone with your body and then you're really with them. But that's not really true because you're not actually your body. It's just that when you touch somebody with your body to their body, then there's sensory experiences. It is a different type of sense, a different kind of experience, and that's something which we tend to associate as being very powerful. And the question is, well, it is powerful, but does that mean that is that you? So you can actually start to think of it as seeing someone on FaceTime is a different sensory experience of seeing them. You can try to figure out what exactly that is. But that's a way to now transcend the limitations of space and time. We are able to sort of be here and somewhere else at the same time. We have many, many different examples of that kind of transcendence that's going on as we become greater and greater. And there's plenty of movies and books and all kinds of literature and culture and even science on the science side where people are looking at the capacity for consciousness to slowly outgrow its bonds that are really too linked to this body and to kind of spread beyond that and to realize that we are not our bodies. We can actually become far more than this, and we can create situations where our bodies are no longer holding us down. And if we can create, just the example of the robots, the nanotechnologies, well, if we can create that level of control of the body, we can eliminate disease. We can make bodies that are gigantic. We can make bodies where you could actually, transfer yourself, just like you transfer, internet information from here to there. So you can transfer yourself from here to somewhere else, and then you are able to basically travel almost instantaneously. That would be a serious, transcendence of the limitations of space and time. We could have situations where instead of, we could find ways to even transcend the rules of the laws of physics of the speed of light, where there could be instantaneous transition from here to somewhere else through some kind of back door or using the Merkava system. There's all kinds of ways to sort of like transcend these things that we are just starting to think about and to be creative about. And there's a lot of literature and writings about these patterns. And it's fascinating if you think about that for a second, because that pattern of transcendence, so we can't even begin to imagine where it's going to take us, but it's going to take us beyond the limitations of this. And when we talk about Olam Haba and Tchias HaMesim, so we tend to think of it as like it's some kind of miraculous thing. Miraculous means an inexplicable, almost magical thing. But magical is, again, a label that we put on something we don't understand and say this happens in some way that is different from the rules of, real life. But what if real life was actually like that? What if real life, we were not actually our bodies? And what if in real life, the process of evolution, as we get more and more and more transcendent like this, so think about what that implies about death. Death just means that the tool that you're using, this thing, because of all of its limitations, it falls apart. It can't last for so long. Well, if you're not your body and you deeply understand that, we actually discover on a scientific level that we are not our bodies and that there's a consciousness self that is part of a much larger self that we call the Nishmasin in Kabbalah, the consciousness matrix that is behind and beyond all things. That there is one self that is manifested in each of us. And we can talk more about that as we go. We will talk more about that. Well, if that's the way things are, so then as we learn to harness and modify this thing and eventually become more and more and more in control of our consciousness and ourselves, so then we will eventually realize that we are not in these bodies. We simply use these bodies and we're attached to them in some way that we're going to discover at some point. Hashem will give us the keys to that as well. If this is real, if we are really selves and we are neshamos, we are consciousness, this is what it means to say the Torah is actually real and true, is that you are this thing, you are an endless self. So if that's true, so then we will eventually be above death, because death just means the body turns off and you're kind of stuck now, not being able to really interact or manifest at the same level as before. There's more to talk about with death also. There's a lot of different, I'm kind of raising a lot of issues and opening a lot of boxes, but the point I'm trying to drive towards really is that Olam Haba, that phase, is a phase in which we are already at a point where it's kind of like we graduated beyond this type of body to the point where now we're almost exponentially rising, where we're no longer stuck with poor memories and unclear thinking and all kinds of convolutions of the body interacting with the mind and the perception and the consciousness. Instead, it's very clear, and we have a path, and we are living forever with bodies that are no longer mortal in that sense. And now we're really unleashed to take all of the depth that we are, the endless, intangible side of ourselves, and now unleash it more and more into the world. We're on that path right now. It's happening. That's when I say the technology, these things that are right in front of us that we have a hard time seeing, is that there's so many debates about smartphones and all these types of technology things, but the big picture of those things is evolution, is the development of ourselves and the control of reality. And when you think about that, yes, of course, there will be little hiccups along the way and what we'll call for lack of a better term right now, maybe even casualties, people who fall and get a little bit hurt by some of these things. We have to talk about what does that even mean? What happens to people who stumble because of these types of things and who make mistakes that are so damaging that they really hurt themselves or others. It's an important discussion as well, how to think about technology in terms of those things. But just to understand the big picture of this stuff. So technology is not something which is just like an extra thing. This is from Hashem. All these things you can't look at things as like there's Hashem and there's Torah and there's religion and then there's like technology and like how do we relate to technology? This is all part of Hashem's reality. There's nothing outside of Hashem. So like this is just Hashem's manifestation and expression through us and as we become more and more and more like Hashem. So that's a very powerful, and I want to even just use this word, it's very hopeful. That's Aliyas Hadoros, because we're about to become the next Dor Hadeya, the generation of experiential knowledge of Hashem, where it's going to be that now the intangible self, the consciousness self of Hashem is going to be manifest because it's real. And we're going to unlock that and we're going to discover that. And we're really getting to a place where we're becoming more and more and more like Hashem. And then when Olam Haba starts, we're going to have just reached where Adam HaRishon was in the story of Gan Eden. And then Olam Haba is now we're going to live forever going up. And that's again, don't confuse sometimes the cultural Judaism perspective is that Olam Haba is like in heaven. That's a Christian perspective. Olam Haba is right here, just that your perceptions are not biologically warped anymore. You see truth. You don't see what you want to see. You don't see what you've been trained to see emotionally or physically or through all these different habituations and inertia. And so it's an unleashing of us and of everyone in this world as a people. And this whole piece is really going to be about that ascension, that climb. And you'll hear it in Rav Kook's words, how he's... the word hopeful doesn't even capture it. It's like super exciting. It's an incredible time period, what we're living in right now. And again, I understand that in some ways it's new and those things can be frightening and this is different and the technology is different and how do we think about these things? But all change is reality. Change is what is real. It is always happening. And so part of being not chotei means saying, I will embrace change. I will just now try to figure out what is the role of this change in the setting and where does it fit into the tangible and intangible HaKodesh side of things. So I know how to use this to now become more and more and more attached to or clear or developed or whole, shalem, in my process of Hashem and me in the world together as really one self, me as an aspect of his larger self. So in the next video, we're going to actually go into the piece itself, and hopefully this intro will help to sort of give the proper paradigm, how to sort of think about where he's coming from, and we'll see how we do with this. It's a little long, but Bezrat Hashem will get through it.